The gray police cruiser crawled behind the pristine silver Cadillac on Cedar Grove Road, tailing it for nearly a mile before activating its lights. Officer Mike Thompson watched with satisfaction as the elderly black man in a crisp military uniform pulled over perfectly to the curb, but that didn't matter to him. It never did. "License and registration," Thompson barked, his flashlight beam deliberately aimed at the driver's eyes, despite the bright afternoon sun. The elderly man reached slowly for his documents, his movements deliberate and dignified. "Sir, I was maintaining the speed limit and using proper signals," the man stated calmly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command. Thompson smirked, checking the license. Well, looks like we've got ourselves another one of those war heroes. Tell me, did you actually serve, or did you just buy this uniform at the surplus store?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. The elderly man's eyes hardened, but his voice remained steady. "I earned this uniform over 30 years of service to our country, Officer Thompson." He emphasized the name on the policeman's badge. "And I continue to serve to this day." Thompson leaned closer, his badge nearly touching the veteran's face. "Listen here, old-timer. I don't care what fancy medals you think you've earned. Around here, I'm the authority. Now, step out of the vehicle." The veteran complied with measured movements, standing tall, despite his age. His ribbon-decorated chest now fully visible, he looked Thompson directly in the eyes. "Officer Thompson," he said quietly, "in exactly 1 week, you're going to deeply regret this moment. But unlike you, I believe in dignity and proper procedure. You'll receive no complaint from me today." Thompson laughed dismissively, writing up a baseless warning ticket. "Is that a threat, old man?" "No, officer," the veteran replied, accepting the ticket with a slight smile. "That's a promise from your new police commander. I start next Monday." The sound of Thompson's citation book hitting the pavement echoed through the suddenly silent street. The Central City Police Department, Officer Mike Thompson's personnel file had grown thick over his 8 years of service. Behind the closed doors of the precinct captain's office, heated discussions about Thompson's conduct had become increasingly frequent. The latest incident report lay open on Captain Reynolds' desk, the third complaint of racial profiling in just 2 months. "We can't keep sweeping this under the rug," Lieutenant Garcia sighed, rubbing her temples. The morning sun cast long shadows across the office as she reviewed Thompson's service record. His technical performance was impeccable, top marksman in the department, highest arrest record, and numerous commendations for bravery. But beneath the sterling statistics lay a disturbing pattern. Thompson's early years in law enforcement had shown promise. Growing up in a small, predominantly white suburb, he joined the force with genuine intentions to serve and protect. His father, a retired officer himself, had instilled in him a rigid sense of order and authority. But somewhere along the way, that desire for order had twisted into something darker. "Look at these traffic stop statistics," Lieutenant Garcia pointed out, spreading papers across the desk. "Thompson pulls over minority drivers at 4 times the rate of any other officer. The justifications are getting thinner each time." She paused, tapping a particular incident report. "Last week, he cited an elderly Asian woman for suspicious driving behavior. She was going exactly the speed limit in a school zone." Captain Reynolds leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation evident in his expression. The department had tried everything: additional training, counseling, partnering Thompson with veteran officers from diverse backgrounds. Nothing seemed to crack the shell of prejudice he'd built around himself. The morning briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-shift activities, officers checking schedules, reviewing reports, and sharing updates from the night shift. Thompson sat in his usual spot near the back, scrolling through his phone, barely paying attention to the daily announcements. His partner, Officer Chen, had requested a transfer last week, making him the third partner to do so this year. And finally, Captain Reynolds' voice cut through the chatter. "I want everyone to be prepared for some significant changes coming next week. We'll be welcoming our new police commander, bringing years of military leadership experience and a fresh perspective to our department." Thompson scoffed quietly. Another bureaucrat with big ideas about community policing and sensitivity training. Just what they needed. He'd seen commanders come and go, each with their grand plans for reform. None of them understood what it was really like on the streets. None of them had faced the split-second decisions that officers dealt with every day. As the briefing wrapped up, Thompson caught fragments of conversation about the incoming commander. Decorated veteran. Harvard graduate. Experience with department overhauls in major cities. He tuned it out, focusing instead on his patrol route for the day. Cedar Grove Road had become one of his favorite spots, a wealthy neighborhood where, in his mind, certain people didn't belong. Little did Thompson know, as he climbed into his cruiser that morning, that his entire worldview was about to be shattered. The next traffic stop would set in motion a chain of events that would force him to confront not just his prejudices, but the very foundation of his identity as a law enforcement officer. The autumn sun climbed higher in the sky as Thompson began his patrol, unaware that the dignified veteran he was about to humiliate would soon hold the power to end his career or transform it. Monday morning arrived at the Central City Police Department with an air of anticipation. The briefing room was packed to capacity, with officers from all shifts present for the introduction of their new commander. Officer Thompson slouched in his chair, absently fiddling with his badge, barely listening to Captain Reynolds' introductory speech. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our new police commander, Commander Robert Washington, Captain Reynolds announced, gesturing toward the door with a broad smile. The click of polished shoes against the linoleum floor drew Thompson's attention. His head snapped up, and the color drained from his face. Standing at the podium, in a pristine police commander's uniform adorned with military ribbons, was the very man he had humiliated at the traffic stop just days ago. The room erupted in applause, but Thompson couldn't hear it over the rushing sound in his ears. He watched, paralyzed, as Commander Washington surveyed the room, his eyes eventually finding Thompson's. There was no anger in that gaze, no triumph or satisfaction, only the same quiet dignity Thompson had mocked just days before. "Thank you, Captain Reynolds," Commander Washington began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he'd used during the traffic stop. "I'm honored to join this department and looking forward to working with each of you." His eyes lingered on Thompson for just a moment longer before addressing the entire room. As Commander Washington outlined his vision for the department, emphasizing community engagement, accountability, and ethical policing, Thompson felt the stares of his fellow officers. Word of the traffic stop incident had spread quickly through the department grapevine. Some officers wore expressions of barely concealed satisfaction, while others showed concern or pity. Officer Chen, Thompson's former partner, leaned over to whisper to another officer. "Karma's finally caught up with him." The whisper wasn't quiet enough, and Thompson felt his face burn with shame. After the briefing, Thompson tried to slip out quietly, but Commander Washington's voice cut through the crowd. "Officer Thompson, a moment in my office, please." It wasn't a request. The walk to the commander's office felt like the longest of Thompson's life. Each step echoed through the hallway, matching the pounding of his heart. Officers and administrative staff found sudden interest in their paperwork as he passed, avoiding eye contact. Inside the office, Commander Washington settled behind his desk, gesturing for Thompson to take a seat. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Family photos lined the commander's desk. Thompson noticed one showing a younger Washington in full military dress, receiving what appeared to be a silver star. "I believe we've already met, Officer Thompson," Commander Washington finally said, his voice level and professional. "Though I doubt you expected our paths to cross again quite like this." Thompson's throat felt dry. The man before him now wasn't just the victim of his prejudice, he was a decorated military veteran, a respected leader, and most importantly, his commanding officer. The carefully constructed justifications for his actions began to crumble. "Sir, Thompson started, but Commander Washington raised a hand. "Before you speak, I want you to understand something," the commander said, leaning forward. "What happens next depends entirely on you. This can be either the end of your career or the beginning of your education. The choice is yours. The weight of those words settled over the office like a heavy blanket. Through the window, Thompson could see the morning sun illuminating the American flag in the parking lot, the same flag both men had sworn to serve under, though in very different ways. The following weeks brought changes that rippled through the Central City Police Department like waves in a pond. Commander Washington's leadership style proved to be as methodical as it was transformative. Rather than immediately disciplining Thompson, he implemented a department-wide overhaul that left no room for discriminatory practices to hide behind protocol. Thompson found himself assigned to the newly created Community Integration Unit, working directly under Commander Washington's supervision. His first assignment was to review every traffic stop he'd conducted in the past year, this time alongside community members who shared their perspectives on each interaction. "Tell me what you see in these numbers, Officer Thompson," Commander Washington said one evening, spreading dozens of reports across the conference room table. The setting sun cast long shadows through the blinds, highlighting patterns Thompson had always chosen to ignore. The statistics were undeniable. The racial disparity in his stops, the flimsy justifications, the pattern of escalation, seeing it all laid bare made Thompson's arguments feel hollow. He remembered the satisfaction he'd felt during that fateful traffic stop, and for the first time, shame replaced pride. "Each of these numbers represents a person," Commander Washington continued, pulling out a particular file. "Like this one, Dr. James Wilson, age 68, cardiologist. He was rushing to perform emergency surgery when you delayed him for 45 minutes searching his car. The patient survived, no thanks to our department." Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he opened the file. The doctor's credentials were impeccable, his record spotless. The suspicious behavior Thompson had noted in his report, nervous glancing at the time, agitated responses, now read differently with context. Commander Washington introduced a new policy requiring officers to activate their body cameras before initiating any stop. Each week, Thompson sat in review sessions, watching his own interactions, played back on screen. The commander's questions were never accusatory, always probing. "What made you suspect criminal activity? What alternative approaches could you have taken? How might the citizen have perceived your tone?" Other officers began treating Thompson differently too. Not with hostility, but with a kind of cautious distance. His usual spot in the break room remained empty, conversations quieted when he entered. He was experiencing, for the first time, what it felt like to be judged based on preconceptions. During one particularly challenging review session, Commander Washington shared something unexpected. "You know, Thompson, in Vietnam, my life was saved by a white soldier who, back home, probably wouldn't have sat at the same lunch counter as me. Combat has a way of stripping away the artificial barriers we build between people." The words hung in the air as Thompson absorbed their meaning. He thought about his own father, whose views had shaped his early understanding of the world. How many of those inherited beliefs had he accepted without question? One rainy afternoon, Thompson watched through his patrol car window as Commander Washington helped an elderly white woman change her tire in the police department parking lot. The commander's uniform was getting soaked, but his focus never wavered from the task at hand. It was a small moment, but it struck Thompson deeply. True authority came not from enforcing power, but from serving others regardless of who they were. As the weeks passed, Thompson began noticing things he'd overlooked before. The grateful smile of a Hispanic teenager when he gave her directions instead of suspicion. The relief in an elderly black man's eyes when a routine stop remained just that, routine. Small moments that had always been there, but hidden behind the wall of his prejudice. The mandatory sensitivity training sessions were scheduled for every Thursday afternoon. Initially, Thompson had viewed them as punishment, but as autumn turned to winter, something began to shift. Commander Washington didn't just oversee these sessions, he actively participated, sharing stories from his 30 years of military service that left the room in profound silence. In Desert Storm, Commander Washington recounted one particularly memorable afternoon. "I commanded a unit of 43 men. Different races, backgrounds, beliefs, but when you're in combat, those differences disappear. Your life depends on trusting the person next to you, regardless of what they look like. The training room was warm, despite the December chill outside, and Thompson found himself leaning forward, absorbed in the commander's words. Washington pulled up a photograph on the projector, a much younger version of himself, surrounded by soldiers of various ethnicities, all covered in desert dust, but smiling. Second from the left, Washington pointed, "That's Lieutenant Richards. He grew up in a small town where his family was the only white household." Third from the right, Sergeant Martinez, raised in a predominantly black neighborhood. Each of these men had every reason to carry prejudices, but they chose to see beyond them. Thompson's notebooks began filling with more than just mandatory notes. He started documenting personal reflections, questioning assumptions he'd held for years. The commander's military career became a window into a world where merit truly outweighed prejudice, where leadership was earned through actions rather than inherited privilege. During one session, Commander Washington brought in a guest speaker, a retired police officer who had served during the civil rights era. The officer's stories of witnessing both the worst and best of human nature during those turbulent times struck a chord with Thompson. "I was like you once," the retired officer had said, looking directly at Thompson. "Thought I had it all figured out. Then I watched my partner, a black officer, run into a burning building to save a white supremacist's child. Changed everything I thought I knew." The training extended beyond classroom sessions. Commander Washington implemented ride-along programs where officers patrolled with community leaders from different neighborhoods. Thompson found himself partnered with Pastor Johnson, a respected figure in the community he had once viewed with suspicion. During their patrol, they responded to a call about teenagers loitering outside a convenience store. Before Thompson could fall back on old habits, Pastor Johnson stepped in. "Those are my youth group kids," he explained. "They're collecting donations for the food bank." What Thompson had initially read as suspicious behavior was transformed through context and understanding. The commander's influence extended to subtle departmental changes. The break room's walls, once bare, now displayed photographs of officers and community members working together at various events. The daily briefings began including cultural context and community updates alongside criminal reports. One snowy morning, Thompson arrived early to find Commander Washington already in his office, reviewing files. On his desk sat a familiar Silver Star medal, the same one Thompson had glimpsed in the photograph months ago. "Come in, Thompson," Washington called out, noticing him hovering in the doorway. "I was just looking at your recent reports. Your interaction patterns have shown significant improvement." Thompson stood straighter, feeling an unfamiliar sense of genuine pride. Not pride in authority or power, but in growth and change. "Thank you, sir. I've been trying to." He paused, searching for the right words. "To see things differently." Commander Washington nodded, picking up the Silver Star. "You know why I keep this here? Not as a reminder of what I achieved, but of what I learned. Valor isn't about power over others, it's about the courage to challenge our own deeply held beliefs." Spring brought new challenges to the Central City Police Department, along with an unexpected joint assignment. Commander Washington paired Thompson with him for a special community outreach initiative in the Cedar Grove neighborhood, the same area where their first encounter had occurred months ago. "We're going door to door," Commander Washington explained as they walked down the familiar street. "No uniforms today, just conversations." Thompson noticed how residents responded differently to them in civilian clothes. There was less tension, more openness. At each house, Commander Washington demonstrated the art of genuine community policing. He remembered names, asked about family members, and listened more than he spoke. Thompson watched as the commander chatted with Mrs. Rodriguez about her grandson's college acceptance, celebrated Mr. Chen's new business opening, and helped carry groceries for elderly Mrs. Jackson. "These aren't just civilians to protect or suspects to monitor," Washington explained between visits. "These are our neighbors, our community members. Each has a story that deserves to be heard." The turning point came when they visited a particular house, one Thompson recognized. It belonged to Dr. Wilson, the cardiologist he had detained months ago. Thompson felt his stomach tighten as they approached the door. To his surprise, Dr. Wilson invited them in for coffee. The walls of his home were covered with family photos and medical achievements. One picture showed him providing free healthcare in underserved communities. Another captured him receiving a humanitarian award. "You know, Officer Thompson," Dr. Wilson said, stirring his coffee, "that night you stopped me, I was rushing to save a police officer's wife. She had suffered a massive heart attack." He paused, letting the words sink in. "She survived, and her husband now volunteers at my community clinic." Thompson sat in stunned silence, the realization hitting him hard. How many other stories had he missed? How many lives had he impacted without ever knowing their full context? As they continued their community visits, Thompson began sharing his own experiences of transformation. At a local youth center, he spoke honestly about his past prejudices and the journey to overcome them. The teenagers' responses surprised him, not with anger, but with respect for his honesty and willingness to change. Commander Washington observed these interactions with quiet approval. During one afternoon break, he shared something unexpected. "You know, Thompson, when I first took this position, many advised me to fire you immediately. But I've learned that sometimes the most powerful changes come from transforming an opponent into an ally." The day took them to a community garden project where residents from all backgrounds worked together. Thompson found himself working alongside a young black teenager, teaching her how to plant tomatoes while she taught him about the different vegetables her grandmother grew. As the sun began to set, they made their final stop at a local diner. The owner, an elderly Vietnamese woman, recognized Thompson from previous encounters, none of them positive. But this time was different. Thompson apologized for his past behavior, and she responded by serving them her special pho recipe, sharing stories of her family's journey to America. "Understanding comes from these moments," Commander Washington said as they ate. "Not from regulations or training manuals, but from shared experiences and open hearts." Let me know when you want me to continue with part 7, the final part of our story. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, the Central City Police Department gathered for their annual community relations ceremony. The auditorium buzzed with an energy that felt different from previous years, more genuine, more hopeful. Community members mingled freely with officers, the invisible barriers of the past notably absent. Officer Thompson stood at the podium, facing a mixed audience of fellow officers, community leaders, and residents. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but his voice remained steady. "A year ago, I was a different person," he began, his eyes meeting Commander Washington's in the front row. "I wore the same badge, drove the same streets, but I was policing with prejudice instead of principle. It took a remarkable leader to show me the difference." The room fell silent as Thompson recounted his journey. He spoke about the traffic stop that changed everything, not shying away from his actions that day. He described the months of learning, understanding, and growth that followed. His voice cracked slightly when he mentioned specific community members who had become not just faces in his patrol area, but people he now knew and respected. Commander Washington sat quietly, his presence a testament to the power of leadership through example. Beside him sat Dr. Wilson, Pastor Johnson, and many others who had played roles in Thompson's transformation. "Today, I don't just patrol our community," Thompson continued, "I'm part of it. When I drive down Cedar Grove Road now, I don't look for people who don't belong, because I've learned that everyone belongs. Every citizen deserves respect, understanding, and equal protection under the law." He then announced the launch of a new department initiative, a mentorship program pairing veteran officers with rookie recruits, focusing on community-oriented policing and cultural understanding. The program would bear Commander Washington's name, honoring his approach to transformative leadership. After the ceremony, as people mingled over coffee and conversation, an elderly veteran approached Thompson. He was wearing a Vietnam service cap, and his eyes carried the wisdom of years. "I saw myself in your story," the veteran said, shaking Thompson's hand. "I came back from war carrying prejudices too. Takes real courage to admit when you're wrong and even more to change. You've done both." Commander Washington joined them, placing a hand on Thompson's shoulder. Change in law enforcement doesn't come from top-down policies alone, he said. It comes from officers like Thompson, who have the courage to confront their biases and the strength to grow beyond them. As the evening wound down, Thompson stood in the parking lot, watching families and officers departing together. The same street where he had once conducted biased traffic stops now felt different, not just a patrol route, but a community he was proud to serve. Commander Washington approached for a final word. You know, Thompson, that day I could have ended your career. Instead, we changed it. Remember that when you're training new officers, sometimes the biggest impact comes from giving people the chance to be better than their worst moments. Thompson nodded, understanding now what true law enforcement meant, not power over a community, but service within it. As he got into his patrol car for the night shift, he smiled at the framed photo he kept on his dashboard, the entire department standing with community members, all connected, all belonging. The story of the racist cop and his commander had become more than a tale of redemption. It was a blueprint for change, a reminder that growth is possible even from the most unlikely beginnings, and that true authority comes not from a badge, but from the heart that wears it.